Hi everybody, hope you're having a great day today. I am. I'm out for a little ride while it's still cool in the morning here in Smyrna, Georgia. It's only in the high 70s. It's going to get a whole lot warmer later. Thought I'd go down one of my favorite roads here. This is Covered Bridge Road, and I'm going to go down here to the bridge. We won't go across the bridge this time, but just going to go down here. What I want to tell you about was when I was a kid and traveling with my father. Now my dad worked for a construction company, and he was a vice president in charge of equipment. Now his job was to go to all the jobs all over the country that the company had jobs, and they did. The construction company he worked for, they did highways. They built the interstates. They built Blue Ridge Parkway. They built big major bridges and stuff like that. Not homes or buildings, things like that. So he dealt with big equipment. He dealt with big dozers and earth movers and cranes and backhoes and things like that. And his job was to be sure that the equipment that was needed to do the job got to the job. Now, if that meant buying equipment or moving it around the country or whatever, he was in charge of figuring that out. And that was kind of a carryover from the war. During the war, he was in charge of procuring materials and things like that for the military during World War II, and he made it all the way to Belgium, and he spent all his time riding around the back roads looking for steel mills and factories of any kind, textile mills, anything that could be put to the war effort to help the Allies. Well, what he did, I think, kind of tied over into that. His job was to make sure that the right stuff got to the right place so that the job could be done. And I got to travel with him when I was, I must have been about 9-10 years old, 11. I did a lot of traveling with him, and sometimes he would take me out of school. Sometimes it would just be a day I had off or something like that, and from school. But I would go with him, and this company was big enough for them. They had an airplane, and they had several, but the one that I got to fly in as a kid was a Beechcraft, Twin Beech, and then later a King Air twin turboprop. Well, in the Twin Beech, when I was a little kid, this is back in the day when things were pretty relaxed for flying. This would have been this would have been like 1960, 61, 62, something like that. Before there was terrorism, before there was any problem with, before everything was so tightly controlled as it is now in terms of flying. And we would fly out of the Charlotte airport, and we would go to airports that were near the construction sites. And sometimes we would go to Florida. We might go to the North Carolina mountains a lot. They had jobs there, and we could have driven certainly into North Carolina, but the plane was available, and sometimes my dad would have to be in more than one meeting at a time. So he would go, he'd go to different things, and I get to fly with him. Well, the pilot for the company was also their insurance salesman. Now, most of the time he just took care of making sure they had insurance to do a job and things like that. Covered all the automobiles, the trucks, all that. I'm sure workman's insurance, things like that. But anyway, he was also a pilot, and he would get up there in the left seat, and he would put me in the co-pilot seat. And we would never fly more than 5,000-6,000 feet at the most. And we would go up, and he would talk to me, and my dad would be sitting pretty much about 6 feet behind me in one of the passenger seats. And he'd strap me in and get there, and I'd sit there and watch everything. And I was really so young that at that time I couldn't see over the dashboard straight ahead. I could look out through the dashboard kind of curved down, and I could look out to the right and see a little bit out between the windshield and the dashboard, and of course I could look out my side window, and I could look out his side window and up, but I couldn't see what was coming straight ahead of us. So, here we go. What do we got? A little work ahead here. Okay, we're not going to go that way. We will turn. Alrighty, anyway, so we'd get up to altitude, and he would show me where the compass was, and he would say, okay, I want you to keep the compass pointed right here, and he showed me where the altimeter was. And the altimeter, he'd say, it's right here. Now I want you to stay right here. Keep that needle right there on that spot there. And so he'd have me going maybe due north, and he'd have me at 5,000 feet. And he'd say, you just do that. Well, he would get up from the passenger seat, from the pilot seat, excuse me, get up from the pilot seat and go back and sit in the back and talk with my dad and whoever else was in the plane, for the meeting, because he had a job at the meeting as well. And so they would have pretty much a business meeting. And he would sit where he could keep an eye on me and literally reach back over his shoulder and grab the control yoke if he had to, in case something went wrong. Well, I was small enough that at this point I really couldn't reach the foot pedals, the rudder pedals, very well. And the rudder pedals, wags the tail this way. And if you don't have the rudder, if you don't use the rudder when you turn an airplane, the nose of the airplane will drop because you use the rudder, opposite rudder, to keep the nose of the airplane up and level. It's called a coordinated turn. And there's a little bubble level on the dash that later, when I learned how to be a pilot, that they say keep the bubble centered, and that means you have a coordinated turn. It keeps you from slipping or sliding or whatever through the sky. But I didn't know anything about any of that stuff. I couldn't do that. So without being able to reach the pedals. So when I would fly along, if there was a cloud that came up, like one of these, we'd be flying right at that cloud, and he had told me, don't fly through any clouds. And I said, okay. So when we would I'd be headed right for that cloud, and I would turn the wheel, and we would ease over, and we would start to go down. So once I'm not pointing at the cloud, now I'd level out, and I'd have to pull us back up to get the needle back up on the altimeter. And I had a blast doing it. And I don't know how much he was able to pay attention to the meeting. I don't know how much he was watching me, because quite frankly, I was so thrilled doing what I was doing. I'm just looking at the instruments and looking out the window. But I'm sure he was where he was keeping an eye on things. But that was, I got to do that with my dad quite a bit. Now, as thrilling as that was, now imagine I'm a kid who's always been absolutely thrilled with heavy equipment, construction stuff. I mean, what kid doesn't have dreams about going out and getting on a bulldozer and pushing dirt around, or a loader, or big pan, racing it around, picking up dirt and dropping it off, things like that. I don't know, maybe you don't, but for me, I've always wanted to do that. It's always been something ever since I was a kid that I was really loved. And we would go to we'd land at these little airports. We might land at the Asheville airport, or we landed somewhere in Florida, and we would, the company would have a truck there for us, and they'd ride us out to the job site where my dad could look at the job and all that. Well, he pretty much turned me loose. He told me just stay out of the way of everything, and said other than that I could walk around and have a good time. Well, I'll tell you about two instances. If I have discussed these before in previous vlogs, please forgive me. I don't think I have, but I'll go ahead and tell you real quickly so that I don't make this too long. We went down to a job in Florida one time, and they were bringing in fill dirt. They had to bring in, 30 or 40 feet of fill dirt for a major highway that was going through maybe part of the Everglades or somewhere down in there, real swampy areas. And if you go to the edge of all this fill dirt, it slopes off down to the side. And down at the very bottom was this kind of swampland. Well, if you've ever cooked chocolate pudding, I don't mean the instant kind. I mean if you've ever really cooked the pudding, where you heat it up on the stove and you put it in the refrigerator, after it sets, it has a dark skin on the top of it. That is, the top part of the pudding. Well, if you dig down in, it's a much paler, looser pudding down at the bottom. It's not homogenized like our instant puddings are. It definitely separates. Well, that's what this mud is like. It's got this thin little skim on the top of it, and the rest of it's just gooey, shaky goo underneath it. Well, I'm down there, I'm climbing up and down on the side of these big dirt fills where they're filling in, getting down farther and farther down toward the goo at the bottom. And there are these little fiddler crabs. You've seen them at the beach. If you've ever been to the beach, little tiny fiddler crabs. They're all over the place. And I'm sitting there taking mud clods and trying to hit the fiddler crabs. I'm a kid. Hey, give me a break. So I'm sitting there trying to hit them, and I finally hit one. with a good, soft, juicy mud clod, and it was right at the edge of the water. And so I climbed down off the side and started walking across this layer of like pudding. And as I'm walking, it's shaking and shimmying. And I get out and I reach over, and I bend down and reach over, and I'm picking up that mud clod because I want to catch that little crab. And I guess I put my weight on my toes too much, and I popped through that surface layer, and I am now up to my chest in that goo. And I mean literally, I went boom that far that quick. Well, I wasn't panicky or anything. I was, you know, I just was filthy. I've been dirty before. Well, I managed to get myself out of it, and I am covered. Just imagine dipping yourself in chocolate pudding up to your up your chest. Excuse me. And I go walking back up to my dad, and he's looking at me, and he's shaking his head, and he's just mad as hell. He says, "What did you do?" And I told him, I said, "Well, I fell in." And he goes, "I see that." Well, they called over a water truck. They got water trucks that run around to, they have to put water down to keep the dust down so they can see what they're doing. And he came over and he had a hose hooked up to it, and they hosed me down and got me pretty clean. And I was soaking wet. I had to ride back in the airplane soaking wet. But my dad, he never forgot that. My dad passed away. He was almost 92 years old, and I bet it wasn't 6 months before he passed that he was reminiscing about that story, and we had a really good laugh about it. But the only other one I'll tell you, one time we went to the mountains. The company was working on a portion of the Blue Ridge Parkway, which is up in the mountains, a beautiful scenic highway, meant really just for the scenery. It's not doesn't take you anywhere in particular. It's a pretty low speed thing. You look it up online, and if you're not familiar with it, it's a really super road. Well, it was pretty challenging to make some of these things. They had to cut into these hills, and it might be several hundred feet of rock face going up that they had to cut and shoot with dynamite to make, to clear a spot where they could put the road through. And I was out with him again on a trip. We had flown up there, and he's doing something, whatever it was. He was talking to the people, seeing what they needed, getting the report from the superintendent about how the equipment was and what they might need and how the job was going. And I started climbing up one of these rock faces because I wanted to get a better look at these heavy equipment, these what they call them, pans or earth movers, that are going up and down the hill pulling this dirt, and they're just flying down this hill. And so I started climbing up. Well, I climbed about, I don't know, I'm probably 100, 150 feet up this thing, and so I can see the whole job site. Well, my dad, I looked over to my left, and I see my dad has come out of the construction trailer that's down at the bottom of the hill there. He's looking all over for me, doesn't see me anywhere, and he finally looks up. One of the guys with him points up and points at me up there, and I'm just sitting there, and I'm sitting on a big rock and just dangling my feet. Now, I don't know how firm this big boulder was I'm sitting on. I just have no idea. But I'm just sitting there dangling, and I can see my dad's kind of agitated, but he didn't tell me to come back down. He talked to a couple of the other guys, and they called over another couple of guys, and I said, well, I guess he wants me to come down. So I turned around, and I didn't climb back down. I climbed up, and it wasn't very far. Another 50 feet or so, I was at the top of the cut, and I was able to walk down the natural grade of the hill, and I walked all the way down to the job site, and I walked around, and I came up, and I walked up, and my dad and about 4 other guys were sitting there looking up the hill where I'd been. And I looked, and there are 2 guys that are climbing, and they're about halfway up. And I walked up behind my dad, and I'm just standing there, and one of the guys turns and looks at me and starts laughing. And my dad turned and looked at me, and he said, "Oh, you scared the hell out of me. Damn, don't you do that again. Those guys are up there going to get you." and I said, "Well, I'm sorry, I didn't know." Again, I'm like 10 years old, and I didn't think anything about it. You're fearless when you're 10 years old. And the poor guys, they whistled, and the poor guys had to turn around and come back down. But I had a lot of fun with my dad. You guys out there that are young, that have young kids, I know you won't have the kind of job my dad did, but If you can, take your kids with you. If there's any way to take them with you to your work or as part of your work, or just take them somewhere. Just go out and have some fun with them. Believe me, they will remember it, and you'll have memories that you'll keep a lifetime. Okay, well, I'm just going to do a little more riding out here. You guys take care. Bye-bye.